What quantum mechanics is to me, it is a set of mathematical tools for calculating statistical correlations between measurement outcomes. And yes, we have to say what measurements outcomes, what that term really means. And the second important point for me is that quantum mechanics requires us to distinguish between a classical domain and a quantum domain. So the question then is, how, how is that so? Why is this so? Why is the reason so? Why should it be so? So again, my starting point is a kind of a Kantian starting point, which says the objective world is something we construct. And okay, those constructions, there's something missing in the sentence. Whatever it is that is objectifiable, that we can think of as aspects or parts of the features of the objective world, all that, what we construct, is subject to two kinds of constraints. So there are internal constraints in our construction of the world, logically or grammatically. There is this logical or grammatical structure of human thought or language. But then importantly, another internal constraint internal to our consciousness, our experience of the world, is the spatial temporal structure in which by which we experience the world, in which, conditioned by which we experience the world we construct. Our fundamental physical concepts, such as substance and causality, energy, momentum, etc., they derive their meanings from these constraints, you know. It's pretty obvious. If we didn't have the experience of space or time, we couldn't talk about momentum or energy. We cannot construct objects considering them as substances. We could not think of them as causally connected, etc. So here, now my definition of the classical domain, it contains objects which are accessible to direct sensory experience. And therefore, because that's the case, our fundamental physical concepts can be applied to it. We can talk about it, about its objects, using concepts we all understand, in as much as we all share the constraints to which these concepts owe their meanings. And that's what Bohr meant by classical concepts. It has nothing to do with classical physics. It just means the concepts whose meanings are rooted in the structure of our logic and our experience, such as substance and causality, most importantly. So now the quantum domain is precisely something new, which Kant did not anticipate, that there is something that is not, we cannot deny its existence, but there is something that is not accessible to direct sensory experience. And because it is not, we can talk about it only in the language of statistical correlations between measurement outcomes. And that means preparations and observations which can be described in classical terms. You know, all that is very much Bohr, but I think I've given a little bit of psychological, metaphysical reasoning supporting Bohr's way of thinking. And I think he didn't himself, Bohr himself did it that well. Sorry, say so myself, but because he said too many confusing things, because he was dealing in a way with people, no, I condescendingly and not seriously, with people like you who might not have that familiarity with the philosophical side, you know. So in the classical domain, I give some Kantian examples of the external constraints. They pick out what what Kant calls the categories of understanding, and then there's substance. You know, first of all, we have to think of perceptions, and some perceptions, they concur in a lawful way. You know, a lion always appears with the same properties, even it can be quite differently perceived. And so simultaneous perceptions are bundled into objects. And substance is the concept that denotes the bundling of simultaneous perceptions into objects, but it has also the classical sense of representing something that exists by itself. So, that's the Aristotelian difference between properties and substances. Uh, um, properties do not exist by themselves. They exist by being properties of substances. Substances, therefore, are precisely the kind of things that can exist. We can exist of them as existing independently. Then there's causality, lawfully connects successive perceptions, and there's also this category of the understanding, which is interaction, that lawfully connects different objects. So it is the lawful order staked out by these categories that underlies our belief in an independently existing external world. It's just that lawfulness, that is just that part of that we can bring everything under these particular concepts, bundle it into a lawful order, and then we can say that exists by itself, independent of us, which is ridiculous. It's not independent of us. We are formulating it, we are thinking it, we are conceiving it. But we cannot also change it, it resists. So it is not just imagination, and that's therefore it is objective, it's an external reality. Now, in the quantum domain, the external constraints also pick out something. They pick out the specific forms of the quantum mechanical correlation laws, those which belong to particle physics, particle in, particle out, correlations between in particles and out particles, and importantly, what we should think of as particles in particle physics are types, species. They are not individual particles, they are types of particles, and the types of particles that exist are, of course, part of the correlation laws that we meet or find or can objectify, externalize in the domain of particle physics. So now, in the classical domain, if that were all, we could think of its objects, which would then be all objects, as substances in the metaphysical sense, which implies we can think of them as independent existences. But the existence of the quantum domain compels up to phase up to the contextuality of quantum mechanics. That's so the properties of quantum objects are contextual. Let's just bore, I don't want to bore you too much, but I find it very important to repeat these ideas. They are contextual in that they are defined by experimental contexts in which they are observed. And the quantum objects themselves, not only the properties, are contextuals in that they are individuated in the experimental contexts in which they are observed. So anybody familiar with this wonderful book by Brigitte Falkenburg, Particle Metaphysics? It's a kind of a Bible to me. She explains it so well how we should or can only or ought to think about particles. And that's very, very different from our ridiculous habit of still trying to think of them as if they were separate, independently existing carriers, individuals carrying substances from properties from one place to another. They are not. That is a completely illegitimate projection of the way we think about classical objects into a domain where there are no classical objects. So as an example, I like to say, if a counter clicks, it is not because it was triggered by an incoming object. The click constitutes the presence of the object. The click tells us, allows us to think about it as if there is something, of course, without that something, there would be no click. But without the click, there also would not be anything there. And without the counter, there would not even be a there, because the counter defines a sensitive region, the region that it monitors. And if there's a click, then that region is objectifiable. We can say there's something in that region, but only the click comes first. It's not that the particle comes first and causes the click. That is again the false atavistic thinking about particles as if they were ordinary substances from the classical ordinary world. So, okay, something the same can be said about particle types. They are defined by the correlation laws of particle physics. We can infer them and also their properties from sequences of clicks. And in those sequences, they are individualized. That is to say, when they make their appearance in the phenomenal world, they are quantum phenomena, but they are not individuated in any way except by us in our minds when we see them, or when we see tracks that allow themselves to be interpreted by us as being caused by passing particles. But that's a point that Schrödinger in his earlier scripts, I don't remember now which one it exactly is, but very emphatically insists that we have only individual observations, and under certain conditions, we can link them and think of individual observations as sequences of the same particles. But if we carry that one step too far, we are just lend ourselves always into contradictions. No? So, when you have two particles at the point A and one at A and one at B, and then later you see one at point C and one at point D, and when you have no properties by which you can distinguish the initial particles and the particles finally observed, there's just no way to saying which is which, There's no individuality of particles. So, okay, now I want to see if I can skip something here, but no, that I find is a very important implication that needs to be stressed. Because of the contextuality of quantum mechanics, we can neither think of classical objects nor of quantum objects as things that enjoy the independent existence that in our ordinary thinking we assign to ordinary objects. Of course, that computer here in front of me exists, whether I sit here or not, look at it or not. Okay, it's all understood. But that kind of independent existence, that becomes very, very difficult to attribute to anything if we take quantum mechanics seriously. You see, the so-called objects of the classical domain, we know pretty well that in some sense they depend on quantum objects. We say they are composed of these quantum objects, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, etc. But then for the quantum objects, they too cannot be taken to be as independent existent substances, because their existence as individuals, not as types. As types, they exist as features of the correlation laws, which are objective laws. But as individuals, their existence depend on the classical objects that evince their presence. So there's a mutual dependence, and of course that's again a very well-known problem of the thinkers, the first founders of quantum mechanics, how they have worried about this apparent circularity that quantum world, the classical world, is presupposed by quantum mechanics, and the quantum mechanical particles make up classical objects, and so anyway. But the point here is, it's no longer possible to think of either type of objects as something that has an independent existence. So my personal favorite way of thinking, and that's where we come closer to the announced Indian classical philosophy. So I prefer to think of the classical domain as the manifested world, and I like to think of the quantum domain as containing what is instrumental in this manifestation. And I have to say a little bit more about this, because what makes it possible to think that way is that nothing prevents us from thinking of a particle observed here with these properties and another particle observed there with those properties as one and the same particle observed twice. Now, you see, that is, I think, an objectionable statement for many, but we have to forget that when we observe a particle, we can observe to what type it belongs, what property it has. These are properties belong only to particle types, and they can be individually observed uh, approximately, because of course you cannot have a precise track. That will only be a sequence of counter clicks, and the closer they are, the more erratic they get. It's well known. So when you think what you observe, you see an instantiation of an extra. Actually, we should distinguish here between external properties or extrinsic. Intrinsic, extrinsic is often used. So the intrinsic properties are considered to be one that the particle carries by itself. It tells us what sort of particle it is. No, these intrinsic properties are never properties of an individual object. They are properties of quantum phenomena from which we can in some way interpret, but not, for all practical purposes, that famous fab, but not exactly as traces of one and the same particle. So the extrinsic properties like position and momentum, we can understand the particle owe them to the means by which they are observed, to quantum phenomena. But the same holds for the intrinsic properties. And if we then think, okay, extrinsic properties belong to the measuring apparatus, but so do intrinsic properties in the sense that we can infer them only from properties of tracks, particle tracks. But what is then, if we still want to think of something that is there, if a counter clicks here, and something else that is there, we have to say these properties, they are all provided by the counters, they are provided by the measuring equipment. But what is the particle in itself? It doesn't have anything by which it could possibly be distinguished from another particle. So if we insist of saying that where a counter clicks, there's a particle, then we can say this click is distinct from that click, and this click reveals certain properties, and that click reveals other properties. But the thing that is there is we cannot think of even of it as two distinct things. It's the same thing, the same thing that is observed twice. Now, there's a wonderful paper that was in the early 2000s that David Mervyn sent it to me. He drew my attention to this paper because he thought that he saw better actually than I saw at that time, that it was quite close to my way of thinking. So this is Ole Ulfbeck and A.G. Bohr. They have this question, where did that click come from? And they insist, and quite rightly, I believe, the individual fortuitous event which quantum mechanics deals with, the click, comes by itself without any cause and is entirely beyond theoretical analysis. So what they are saying, there is no longer a particle passing through the apparatus and producing the click. Instead, the connection between source and counter is inherently non-local. We all know about the non-locality of EPR correlated particles when they are simultaneously detected with properties that are always correlated. When we cannot explain the correlations either by a common cause or by a direct interaction. So neither works. So say there is a connection between one click and another, or one observation and another, and it is an inherently non-local connection. But the same is true if I observe a particle here and observe a particle at a later time. The idea that there is something that moves from here to there and is the same particle, that is again a totally illegitimate projection from the classical world into the quantum world. It's not. So this connection between particles seen now and particles seen later is as non-local as the connection between two EPR correlated particles. So, that's not saying, if we still feel like thinking of the click on of the counter as indicating the presence of something, but we can no longer think of this something as carrying properties. Properties are provided by the classical environment, by the quantum phenomena in the experiential world. So we cannot think of the things whose presence is indicated by distinct clicks as distinct things. But we can think of them as one and the same intrinsically indeterminate being. And now I'm getting at the center of classical Indian philosophical thinking. So again, we can think of the process of manifestation. I said there's a difference. Classical world is the manifested world. Quantum world tells us something about quantum domain, rather. There's no quantum world. Quantum domain tells us something about the manifestation, the transition. And about the manifestation of the classical world, or simply the manifested world, as a transition from the unity of that single ultimate constituent, that intrinsically indeterminate being, to the multiplicity of the manifested world, as a transition. It's not a transition in time, it is a logical transition. We are free to think of this transition as taking place across stages, typified respectively by formless particles, non-visualizable atoms, and partly visualizable molecules, So we come from one being becoming many beings without as yet having any properties to be composite entities like atoms, which are not yet visualizable, but can be understood as not as individuals, but as constructs constructed with the help of the laws of the correlation laws of particle physics. And so we are free to think of these types of objects not as constituent parts of the manifested world, but as instrumental in its manifestation. So now comes an important question. How are we to describe the intermediate stages at which the definiteness of properties and the distinguishability of objects are as yet unrealized or only partly realized. So my answer, proposed answer, whatever is not intrinsically definite and distinguishable can only be described in terms of probability distributions over what is intrinsically definite and distinguishable, namely possible outcome indicating events, or if you like, value indicating or property indicating events. So what is instrumental in the manifestation of the world can only be described in terms of correlations between events that happen or could happen counterfactually in the manifested world. So, okay, I think it's a pretty good explanation of why we are dealing with all these statistical correlations in the first place. Second question, what accounts for the intrinsic definiteness of measurement outcomes? Which is actually also goes into defining what we mean by a measurement outcome. So the answer is, the measurement apparatus is needed not only to realize and define quantum observables along with the values they can possess. It is also needed to indicate the actually possessed value of a quantum observable. But no property or value can be indicated in the absence of a sentient observer to whom it is indicated. So the reason the properties of the manifested world are intrinsically all by themselves definite and therefore incapable of coherent superposition, however hard people may try. The reason is quite simply that it is an experience world, and that means it is not only a manifested world, it is a world that is manifested to us. So here we are, we experience a world, and there is a being, a single being out there that manifests this world to us. And now the remaining question would be, so how actually are we related to that being? If, in a sense, I said we cannot take quantum objects. In fact, is a very questionable term because what populates the quantum domain is not properly characterized as an object. But anyway, as types, they're types, but not objects in the sense of individual objects. So we cannot take the quantum objects as existing in themselves and then building up the classical world on top of them. But we cannot also take the classical world as existing in itself because we need it needs the quantum objects in our ordinary way of thinking as their components, or rather, I would say, as the tools by which they are manifested. So a little further. So here comes consciousness and subjectivity becomes a little more central. So Husserl's famous paradox of human subjectivity. On the one hand, the world exists in consciousness, or it exists for us as conscious subjects. And on the other hand, consciousness exists in the world as a feature of objects like us. So that's a dilemma. It's a challenge. That's, of course, in other words, your mind-body problem. But that I hate that mind-body problem thing because it always kind of implies that there's first the body and then how do we get the mind into it? What about there's first the mind and then it produces the body through its categories of the understanding, but that construction of bodies doesn't go all the way down. It takes us into a realm where we cannot talk about objects anymore, and neither quantum objects nor classical objects as individual things, as self-existing things, as substances, but there is one thing, one ultimate constituent that we can actually think of as existing by itself. And what it does to us, it manifests the world to us. So there is one single object, one single being behind the multiplicity of the world. And so there is, now let me come to that here. I want to just discount also two ways of which we cannot really deal with this dilemma of world existing in consciousness, consciousness existing in the world. It's a hen and egg, if you like, which comes first. So taking hold of the objective horn, we can gain an understanding of certain causal chains that lead from external objects to firing patterns in brains. But then, of course, we find ourselves stymied by the notorious explanatory gap between neural processes and conscious experience. But when you take hold of the subjective horn, that is what philosophers like Kant have done, and many after him, we gain an understanding of the general structure of human empirical knowledge, its dependence on the logical structure of rational thought and the spatial temporal structure of human perceptual experience. But then we find ourselves stymied by the same explanatory gap approached from the other side. For since the brains studied by neuroscience are objects of perceptual experience, you can't tell me otherwise, because they all deal with things they perceive and study things they perceive. They cannot then, these brains being objects of perceptual experience cannot then be simplistically invoked to account for perceptual experience. No? So now we come to those very important central scriptures of classical Indian metaphysics. Psychology, I would say metaphysics is only an aspect of Indian philosophy. Uh, it is very much psychological in the sense of being based on actual experiences that go a little beyond our ordinary everyday experience of the world or of the laboratory. So I maintain that the resolution of the dilemma cannot be found in matter, in as much as matter is itself the final outcome of the process that created the dilemma. So I want to explain now what it is that creates this dilemma, this paradox of human subjectivity, being in the world and at the same time having the world in ourselves, in our consciousness. So the Upanishads affirm an ultimate reality to which they refer to as Brahman. So let me stick to the term Brahman. Other terms I used to like as you are in capitals that Weizsäcker, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker used to like that because it can stand for ultimate reality, you are, but it can also mean something that is truly original or the origin of things, because the German prefix ur, like Ursprung, for example, meaning origin, means original. Okay, so by the way, so the relation between Brahman and the world, now this is a funny thing about this Brahman, you can't describe what it is in itself, you know, you can describe the world because you have the categories in which to describe the world, which are basically implanted in your logic and in your um, uh, the structure of spatio-temporal experience, you know, the structure of your perceptions, the spatio-temporal structure of your perceptions. So there's no way to describing Brahman in any such ways. But what these ancient sages, Upanishads, they go way back, you know, a few thousand years, up to about the so-called actual period, 500 BC. So Brahman relates, you can say how Brahman relates to the world. And it is a being, okay, Sanskrit Sat, that constitutes the world, but it is also at the same time a consciousness that contains the world, and most importantly, and uh, something without which everything else wouldn't make much sense. It is a pure quality delight. That kind of thing, what it is intrinsically, would certainly be beyond the subject-object dichotomy. So objectively, if you want to refer it as absolute quality, infinite quality. Subjectively, you would refer to it as delight of existence, infinite bliss. So that creates the world, and Brahman relates to the world as that which creates the world. It is this pure quality or delight that creates the world in order to experience and express itself. Now, the world doesn't appear to us, an expression of pure infinite delight and quality. So I'm not really coming to that explanation. That would be taking us much too far. Why the world looks basically as shitty as it does right now to us, So I'm not talking about that. There's much to be said about that. So Brahman is another aspect of Brahman, what it can do. It has abilities, powers. So it is capable of adopting different cognitive or determinative poises relative to the world. And now what is very important, that in its very original poise, the two, being and consciousness, are as yet undifferentiated. So there is a world, and you describe this world, you can describe, rather, let us say, the process of creation by saying that being determines itself, or by saying that consciousness gives itself content. It is saying the same thing in two different languages. Because we don't have a language in which this is one and the same thing. We have to say it in two different ways of expressing, ways of talking. But that's the original poise. And so don't try to imagine how the world would look like to a being that contains the whole world and constitutes the whole world, and without any difference between saying these two things. So, but there is a first departure in this. This is the philosophy of the Upanishads. There is this stepwise departure from the original consciousness that is the being that determines itself and becomes the world, and the consciousness that gives itself content and becomes the world. So in a first departure from it, we get individuation, because in the original status, poise of this consciousness, there is only one subject and one object, and therefore this one subject and this one object are the same thing. That's why we can talk about it as something that determines itself, or some consciousness that gives itself content. So, so in this secondary poise, we have individuation. That is to say, this one, the self of this ultimate consciousness, this all-containing self, adopts at the same time a multitude of standpoints within the world from which it experiences the content of its consciousness in perspective. And there we have our perspectival consciousness, where we see from one point in perspective. Now, the self not only contains the world, but also is multiply contained in it. So, Husserl's paradox has come into the picture. But to a consciousness of that kind, it is not yet a paradox. Individuation is, you can say, it is brought about by a multiple concentration of the consciousness that is one with being. It concentrates itself here, there. It looks at itself from these different standpoints, pretends to be multiple, but still knows very well it is one and the same consciousness and one and the same substance that constitutes everything. But there's a second departure from Brahman in which this multiple concentration becomes exclusive. Now, exclusive concentration of consciousness is something we are quite familiar with, because when we attend to a work, we concentrate on it, we eliminate everything else from our consciousness. Only that one thing on which we are focused is in our mind. The rest is removed by exclusive concentration. And this is in some way how the one self and one constituent of the world comes to appear a multitude of separate selves. We are all that. We are all that one being, that consciousness. Now I'm starting to talk like a guru, but anyhow, that's the way I understand the world. So with this exclusive concentration, we come to appear to be a multitude of separate individual beings. And when this results, when this happens, now, first of all, we cease to be conscious of our mutual identity. I don't am directly consciousness that I'm you and you and you and you. The second result is that, of course, if we don't perceive anymore, experience anymore that which is the same in all of us, well, we lose sight of the infinite quality and delight that is at the heart of reality. Because that is conscious only to a consciousness that also knows itself to be everything. So there's a third result of this exclusive concentration of consciousness, is that the subject-object dichotomy has now become an irreducible aspect of reality. Now we are dealing with subjects, we have objects, and now Husserl's paradox is a paradox at this level of consciousness. So one can say that Sri Aurobindo uses this term very much. First of all, he talks about the supramental consciousness and supermind simply by saying that is the consciousness of the one by the one, which is beyond mind. So as to give it another name, you can call it supermind, or supramental, just above the mental consciousness with which we are familiar with. Not quite, because that, you see, we can understand how the characteristics of mental consciousness, the problems with which it is confronted, originate not in our coming out of, evolving out of matter, but in a kind of devolution or progressive involution from a consciousness superior to us. So then this process of involution can be carried further according to Upanishadic philosophy. So there, the Upanishads recognize two intermediate principles which are instrumental in the development of the infinite quality delight, which is reality itself, into finite forms, that is to say, the creation of a world. One principle is mind, in Sanskrit manas, the other principle is life, in Sanskrit prana. And in this philosophy, mind is essentially a power that can develop this infinite quality delight into expressive ideas. And life would essentially be the power to develop expressive ideas into finite forms. So now that is to say that this process of involution can be carried further. That is to say, as the supramental consciousness can come to be involved, imprisoned, and it's there, but it's not, its powers are not active or in evidence. And so mind can come to be involved in this particular principle of power of life. That is to, life is still creative and expressive of ideas, but it's not conscious of those ideas anymore. It's just it does its thing, but the flower does its thing, but it's not conscious of what it is doing. The creative idea behind it is no longer in possession of the flower. So Involution then begins in this view with a multitude of individuals that are conscious of their mutual identity, and it ends or appears to end with a multitude of formless entities, and that's the things which we are usually referred to as the fundamental constituents of matter. But there's one step further, since the properties including their numerical distinctness, so the properties of these so-called fundamental constituents of matter are contextual, then intrinsically, that is to are we taken out of their context, they are identical again in the strong sense of numerical identity. So we go from the one being everything, being conscious of everything, to an apparent also a single object, a single ultimate constituent, but all the essential faculties of Brahman, the power to freely determine itself, its freedom, its inherent quality and bliss, are gone. So involution therefore ends with Brahman being effectively deprived of its inherent consciousness and self-determining force. So the ultimate subject, which is infinitely creative objects, is rendered implicit in a single indeterminate object, which then might explode into what we call particles and all the rest, and evolution gets started. So this whole downward involution, this whole process is what has set the stage for the adventure of evolution. So why this involution has a lot of, you're familiar with Houdini? The younger people maybe not. The older people may remember the stage magician Houdini, who was very, very famous. Is now still being copied by lots of stage magicians. So he had himself imprisoned in cages, in all kinds of contraptions, and his skill was to always escape from those prisons. And for me, this is a very apt, quite beautiful simile of what's happening in this world. Here's this infinite, this Brahman with its infinite delight and an infinite quality to express itself, locking itself up in what looks to be inconscient matter and seemingly having no kind of freedom at all, yet eventually bursting out, first as life, then as mind. And then what is really the most important part of the whole story is that there is a higher consciousness that is yet to evolve. And only if we actually get there are will we be able to understand the mess of this world as it is or as we presently perceive it. So there is a letter that Sri Aurobindo has written to a French playwright, Maurice Maigre, and I have reproduced that here in this one of my Substack posts. So why this process of involution? Best explanation I can find is in this letter that Sri Aurobindo has written to Maigre. Then, of course, there's now also the question of why do the laws of physics actually have the particular forms that they do? And we've got to stick to the so-called standard model because that is fantastically proven correct in every detail. And if people find things that they are not yet explained or need further explanation, that's all fine. Speculations abound. I'm not concerned with them. What is truly well tested is the standard model. So then I'm asking in these particular references, why is it actually? Why do the laws of physics have the particular form that they do? And what I'm essentially arguing is, well, they're just setting the stage for the adventure of evolution. And we're coming here close to the end. That's a question by John Searle, a well-known philosopher also. And I like this question. If you were designing an organic machine to pump blood, you might come up with something like a heart. But if you were designing a machine to produce consciousness, who would have thought of 100 billion neurons? So the question is, what I'm saying here is, I don't agree with the view that brains produce consciousness. But there are two valid questions here. So what if they, even if they do not produce consciousness, they certainly play a role. And then why in particular this need for this incredible intricacy, 100 billion neurons? So what the Upanishads would say in regard to the first question is that in think again of Brahman's original cognitive determinative poise, where subject and object are undifferentiated as yet. So there, to know is to be, and to be is to know. Being and knowing is one and the same thing. You know, it's one act, inseparable. The foundation of all knowledge is this identity. So if anybody can know anything, it is because at the bottom, subliminal to us, we are not aware of it, but there is this identity that makes it possible for us to know anything. Now, if we look at the next step, when Brahman adopts a multitude of localized standpoints, then this knowledge by identity takes the form of a direct knowledge. At this stage of involution, or this step towards involution, each individual knows the others directly. There is no need for mediating representations, because you see, they are still also conscious of their mutual identity. And they know then this identity as being the means by which they can be conscious of each other and aware of each other. But if Brahman identifies itself with each standpoint to the exclusion of all others, then this knowledge by identity takes the form of an indirect knowledge. So we go from identity to direct knowledge to indirect knowledge. And an individual's indirect knowledge relies on a direct knowledge of some of its internal attributes, such as neural firing patterns, which serve as representations of external objects. I'm trying to make this a little clearer here. This subject of representation is, of course, a very big subject also in metaphysics and psychology, cognitive science. Since Brahman has nothing but itself to create a world, you know, it creates a world by entering into reflexive relations. You know, that is just relations with itself. It doesn't take stuff and makes things out of stuff. It creates self-relations, reflexive relations. And in that way, it manifests forms, and in that way, it manifests worlds. So this, for example, is why the shapes of material things resolve themselves into spatial relations between what appears to be a multitude of formless things, you know, the so-called fundamental particles, electrons, for example. They are formless things. When we say that something has no form, we certainly cannot expect to see a form, you know. It just means it can no longer be divided into, it cannot be decomposed into more things. Stupid to say smaller things. We cannot be decomposed into more things. And since the form of a thing is precisely the relations that exists, the internal relations of an object that define its form, then the ultimate constituents of forms, or the ultimate relata of those relations that make up forms, they're not only ultimately one and the same thing, they're not only numerically identical, they're also formless because they're instrumental in the manifestation of forms. So therefore, we can think of involution, this process of involution, which set the stage for the adventure of evolution, can be described as Brahman turning itself inside out. You know, in the supramental poise, so this original poise of consciousness and being, all relations are internal. The manifested world is internal to that consciousness. When involution is complete, all relations are effectively external. That is to say, they are not now internal to a single being that contains them in its consciousness. They are now external. They obtain between appear to be distinct relata. So where knowledge is indirect, that's in between these two extremes, as it is in Brahman's mental poise, certain relations are internal, others are external, you know, and some are both internal and external, like in particular the relations that constitute certain patterns of neural activity. So I would say, you think of whatever goes on in our brains, some of these things play the role of representations in some sense. And as such, they are both physically representing external things, that is to say, still as physical goings on in a physical or external objective object, a brain, objective brain. But since at the same time they are internal, that this is, so they have become internalized, and with the internalization comes consciousness. Total consciousness, ultimate consciousness is when everything is internal. And total inconsciousness is when everything is external. But we are midway, you know. That is to say, we have structures internal to us, and because they are internal us, we can be conscious of what they represent. And insofar they are external, that is to say, basically just physical relations or operations, they are by external means related to the external objects that they represent to us. So these structures are both mental representations and as such internal to us, implying the existence of a consciousness to which they are internal, representing a world in that particular consciousness. And at the same time, they are still external, which makes it possible to get mental representations of external objects, you know. So I think, okay, that's as far as we can probably go with our limited consciousness. But here's one more thing. That's one, no, there's even more. I think I should, I must be boring you. Keep talking and talking. So one word more about representations. They are often said to be encodings. So our brains extract information from images falling on our retinas, and this information is said to be encoded in patterns of electrochemical pulses in brains. So if these patterns are to give rise to experiences of a world extended in space and time, they have to be decoded. And this decoding or interpretation presupposes acquaintance with the expanse of space and the passing of time. And this acquaintance is not something that neural processes can provide. You know, this is a point, of course, that needs to be argued in some more. I have in several places argued it in some detail. Um, you know, that the passing of time is an aspect of our consciousness This passingness is qualitative. You can measure, okay, you can measure the temporal distance between one event and another, sure. But the awareness that things can happen one after another, this passingness of time is a totally subjective aspect of our awareness of the world. And we are not getting it out of neural representations. We are having it. It is given to us in our consciousness, in our conscious apparatus or mental apparatus, uh, to make sense of these representations in terms of a spatio-temporally organized world. Now, the same for time, for space. Space is a quality, speciality, being extended is a quality of which we can only talk because we are conscious of it. I often refer to an imaginary friend, which I used to call Andy, and Andy lives in a spaceless world. And Andy is good at maths. So he can think of a set of, call the elements points. He can think of relations between the points, which he could call distances. But he would nevertheless be completely unable to interpret these as in that qualitative sense of a spatial expanse, a spatial extendedness. The mathematics would remain purely mathematics. It would remain set theory. So now my point here is that whatever our perceptual apparatus provides the brain with that kind of information, that is decoded, that is interpreted, and that needs a decoder, an interpreter, and then this decoder or interpreter knows how to make sense of that information in terms of a world in space and time. And this is I maintain that this is something, this internal interpreter, this knowledge that comes from within us and is needed, a pre-existing knowledge that is needed to make sense of the information that comes to us through our very limited senses. This is something, the source of this deeper understanding, which is needed to combine the external input with our qualitative pre-existing knowledge into an actual perceived world. That is a subliminal consciousness. It is, we have it inside of us, but we are not normally, one can become conscious of it, we are not normally conscious of it. So there's our ordinary surface consciousness, and we can think they are external objects, and they act on brains, and the brain somehow provides information to this surface consciousness, but this information is insufficient. It is supported by an intuition, subliminal, from a subliminal consciousness, and that subliminal consciousness has what we lack. It has still that direct knowledge, which we have lost in the process of descending from a supramental consciousness to the mental level. So that's my way of making sense of things that otherwise I find extremely hard to make sense of.